research. So I'm going to start out just giving you a little bit of history about the development of ethical guidelines in research, and then briefly review some of the important concepts from the chapter. So there was a time when we didn't have ethical standards for research on humans. We simply trusted scientists to make good decisions about how they treated their participants. Unfortunately, we reached a time where there were such terrible things happening to participants that we did need to step in and set up the standards that should be involved in research on humans. So one of the first things that happened was the Nuremberg Code was developed in the late 1940s. This came about because of the horrible treatment to concentration camp victims who were being used as research subjects. So Nazi doctors and scientists went on trial for murdering concentration camp victims as well as causing other lasting harm. They did things like expose people to extreme altitudes or temperatures to see how long they could survive, break and re-break bones to see how many times the human body would heal itself. So some really terrible things that were happening, and so they were put on trial, and during the sentencing phase, the prosecutors presented 10 requirements for research using humans, including informed consent, basing research on prior animal work when possible, the risks should be justified by the benefits, only qualified scientists should be conducting research, physical and mental suffering must be avoided, and research in which death or disabling injury is expected should not be conducted. Now that all may seem like common sense, but there were these people making poor decisions, and so these things needed to be spelled out. In 1964 was the Declaration of Helsinki. The World Medical Association developed a code of ethics for medical research with therapeutic intent. What was important about this was that the journal editors now required compliance with that code of ethics, which basically meant that as a scientist, you were not going to get published in journals unless you had adhered to that code of ethics. This also helped to set the stage for the development of the IRB process. IRB is the Institutional Review Board. This is an objective set of people who review a study before allowing that study to be carried out. And so anybody who gets federal funding, including George Mason University, has an IRB, and that IRB has to approve your research study before you're allowed to start that study. The IRB actually specifically came about because Henry Beecher published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, and he highlighted a couple dozen ethically questionable research studies that had been published. The United States Public Health Service then issued a memo requiring research be reviewed and approved by outside reviewers before it was allowed to proceed. And they couldn't get research funding unless there was that IRB approval. In 1979, which really is not that long ago, the United States put forth the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report was the result of a panel from the federal government that got together, studied basic ethical guidelines required when doing research on humans, and produced these 3 principles that must be followed. Respect for persons, which involves informed consent and privacy. Informed consent means that participants voluntarily participate in a study and are told the general aspects of what they're going to be asked to do prior to their participation. Beneficence, which is about maximizing the benefits and minimizing the harm to participants. And justice, which is about the fair treatment of participants and the protection of vulnerable populations. This Belmont Report, the federal panel that was created to study ethical guidelines, came about because of the Tuskegee study. So I have a link at the top of this page to a very short video that talks about the Tuskegee study, and Morling does a great job describing it in the textbook as well. But this really was one of the big turning points for ethics for research on humans. There were a lot of bad decisions that were made during the Tuskegee study. The unethical choices that were made included the participants not being treated respectfully, harming the participants, and the participants were a targeted, disadvantaged social group. So make sure that you take a look at least at that video and then read the chapter as to the details of that study. So the Belmont report that came after the Tuskegee study was made public had the 3 different principles, with each one having specific applications. So the respect for persons, that involves the informed consent that I talked about, so voluntary participation. People are allowed to stop participating whenever they want. So there's no forcing people or in any way coercing them to be part of a research study. They must always do so voluntarily. This also includes protection of vulnerable populations. So this can be anybody under the age of 18 is considered vulnerable. Prison inmates are vulnerable, pregnant women, people with cognitive deficits. So there's a list of vulnerable populations, and those groups should be afforded special protection when they're involved in research. The principle of beneficence, that's the whole weighing the benefits versus the risks to participants and to society. Justice is all about how the participants are being selected. So do they represent all of the people who will benefit from the study? And so we want to make sure that we've got good representation, that we're not just targeting certain groups to be in the study, even though others will benefit as well. The cost benefit that's part of the beneficence principle basically looks like this. So on the x-axis, we have the risk to participants, low or high. And then on the y-axis, the benefit to society, low benefit or high benefit. So there's a couple of very clear decisions. So for example, if it is low risk to participants and high benefit to society, then definitely do the study. No doubt there that that study should be carried out. If it's high risk to participants and low benefit to society, then that's also a very clear decision. Do not do that study. However, the other two are a little bit less clear. If it's low risk to participants, but also low benefit to society, that's more questionable, because now you're using resources, and if there's not much of a benefit to society, then do you really want to be using all of those resources for that study instead of directing them to a more informative study that could be done? And then the other unclear one is if there's high risk to participants but a high benefit to society, then that's going to involve a lot more discussion about whether we carry out a study that is high risk to participants. In some cases, the information that we could get from that study could be considered beneficial enough that it might be undertaken as long as the participants are fully aware of the risks to themselves. The APA does have specific guidelines that it puts out for psychologists, and they have a webpage devoted to describing those principles and the code of conduct for psychologists. The principles that they have are the same as the 3 Belmont principles, with the addition of 2 more. So in bold in this table are the ones that are similar to the Belmont principles, and then the 2 additional ones are fidelity and responsibility. That's all about trust between a psychologist and the people that they're working with, whether that's in research, teaching, or clinical practice. And integrity, striving to be accurate, truthful, and honest. These are not enforceable in any way. They are more aspirational. So these are principles that we should aspire to as psychologists. Then the APA has ethical standards for research. There are 10 of these, and these are enforceable. The one related to research is Standard 8, and within this standard, is the guidelines about using institutional review boards, which must be used for our research, informed consent, which we've talked about, the guidelines for deception. So deception means that we don't tell participants all of the details of the study before they participate. It might be that if we tell them too much about the study, that they would behave differently because of knowing the purpose of the study. And so while we might tell them, you're about to interact with another participant for the next 10 minutes, you're going to be getting to know each other, maybe we don't tell them that the purpose is to see how first impressions work or how people respond to different kinds of other groups. So deception is allowed by the APA, but you need to have justification for why you should use deception in your study. There's got to be a good rationale to using it, otherwise it should not be used. Debriefing means that at the end of the study, participants should be fully told about the purpose of the study and what they did in the study. Particularly if there was deception used, it is absolutely necessary to have a full debriefing. You want to make sure that participants leave the study feeling okay about themselves and without any concerns. They have specific guidelines about research misconduct, so unfortunately this does occur. Data fabrication is about making up data. Yes, that has happened. Data falsification, changing the data to fit your hypotheses, that unfortunately has also happened. In those cases, what we're moving towards, and we'll talk about this more in the next chapter, is more of an open science where we share things with other researchers and we're more open about what we're doing with the study so that people can get back to trusting each other within our field. Plagiarism has to do with copying someone else's work, and I know that you've talked about that extensively within the lab. And then it does have a specific standard about animal research. So animal research is allowed. There are 3 R's that we think about with regard to animal research. One is replacement. So if we can use something besides an animal model, then we want to do that for the research. Refinement just means making sure that we're using the best equipment possible for the animal research. And then reduction is about reducing the number of animals that have to be used for the study, using the fewest possible. Obviously, there's controversy about animal research, mainly because animals can't voluntarily participate, and so they are being obviously forced to participate outside of their own will, and so there is this ethical balance of the welfare of the animals and animal rights, as opposed to the valuable information that we can gain from studying animals in ways that we may not be able to study humans. So this is definitely a controversial area, and there is a specific group that has to approve animal research called the IACUC. That's how that acronym is pronounced. And so anybody doing research with animals has to go through the IACUC to get permission to carry out that research. So with all of ethical decision making, there needs to be this thoughtful balance. So there's different priorities to consider, weighing the potential harm to the human or animal participants against what we might learn from that research. So there are a lot of cases within psychology that we can take a look at to see what decisions might have been made differently, whether they could still be carried out today. I've listed in the module several examples of previous studies where we now consider it ethically questionable, and so take a look at those if you're interested in them. It's unfortunately that we do have cases where we look back and wonder why they were allowed to be carried out, but those things help to guide us in the decisions that we make today as well.